Hello, today we are going to be discussing Japan. We're talking about several different eras within Japanese history. We will also talk about the emergence of samurais and the different social systems that emerged during medieval Japanese history. If at any point during this lecture my audio is going quicker than you are writing, feel free to pause. So pause, write, take your time. And when you're ready to pick up on the audio again, just press play. So the geography of Japan is unique. It is a series of islands known as an archipelago, and because of its isolation, it has formed a unique culture. We can see that there are several main islands that make up Japan. The 4 main islands are listed on the slide. Japan is around the size of California. Some of the closest places to Japan are Korea, which is around 120 miles away, and China, which is roughly 400 miles away. Russia is also very close to Japan, but during medieval history, we do not have much interaction between anything in Russia and Japan. So here we have a timeline of Japanese history. We are going to be focused on the period basically between 710 and 1600. So that's, basically our medieval time frame that we've been in throughout the year and that the majority of the events we have studied have occurred in. So we are going to be talking about the Nara period and the Heian period in Japanese history, which you can see on the screen. The Nara period goes from 710 to 794. And the Heian period goes from 794 to 1185. We will then pick back up talking about some social institutions that form in later Japanese history around 1560 to almost 1900. We will see these same systems in existence. So our Nara period, which occurs between 710 and 794, is named because the capital is going to be moved to Nara, which is a city in Japan. Nara is a city that still exists today. Some features of this period is Buddhism was extremely popular, and we're going to see artisans creating Buddhist sculptures and Buddhist temples. We'll discuss more about the Nara period as we go throughout the slideshow. Nara economy is going to benefit due to roads being built. And as we learned with Rome, if we have roads being built, that means there is an infrastructure in existence. There are people in the government who are able to plan. They have tax money in order to create these roads. And roads are going to allow for more efficient trading. Before the Nara period, we typically had the capital moving with the change in emperor. But we're going to see consistency during our Nara period. The capital will remain in Nara. It will move later on, but for the majority of the period, we will have more consistency. And we know if you have leadership that is effective, that is going to allow your society to flourish rather than to fall. In this graph before, you can see kind of who is ruling Japan during our Nara and Heian periods. So from 710 to 856, our emperors and our nobles are running the show. There's going to be a change for around 200 years after that. We are going to have a new group of nobles that take charge. There's going to be a little bit of a warring states period occurring in this last time frame from 1086 to 1156. We won't go into too much detail about that, but similar to the warring states periods that occurred in China, there will just be a little bit of a disarray and not too many strong leaders occurring during that time. Okay, so how were people affected? How was their life affected during the Nara period? Taxes are going to be a heavy burden on peasants, and we know that is going to make the peasants unhappy. That was one of the reasons for the downfall of Rome. So as you can imagine, a similar situation will happen. If you have the peasants being heavily taxed, there's going to be problems. They might not be able to feed themselves, which we know can lead to other problems like increased theft and some rebellions. In the Nara period, most peasants did not own their own land, which means they're going to be tenant farmers. Basically, they are renting the land that they farm. Basically, the problem of the upper class is going to be finding people to work their land. So the upper class is going to rely on these peasants to work their land. We will see this relationship, how it forms in a moment. We're going to discuss feudalism. And I won't go into detail on that right now, but basically it's a relationship that exists between the peasants who work the land and the nobles who actually own it. Life in Nara Japan was difficult. They're going to have to face natural disasters. There's going to be unrest within the society. They do not have too many advancements that make their life easy. Remember, this is still basically ancient times. We don't have cell phones. We don't have mechanical equipment to build our temples. People are doing this by hand. It is hard labor. The population of Nara, Japan is going to be a little bit over 5 million people. Now, during the Heian period, we will see that population increase to around 6 million people. Now, keep in mind, the population of medieval China was over 120 million people. So Japan is going to be very small in comparison, but they are also very much smaller geographically, so that makes some sense. So education in Nara. In the Nara period, and basically until modern times, we're going to see Japanese documents, not only documents, but we're going to see cultural things like novels and poems. They're going to be written in Chinese. And that kind of shows us that rather than focused on learning about Japanese culture, the upper class is going to be looking at China. So that was the ideal. If you were to be educated, you were probably going to be learning about Chinese history. You might even be sent to China to go to school. So the culture of Japan was not center stage. The Heian period. Again, this occurs between 794 and 1156. So immediately after our Nara period, the Heian period begins. Some characteristics of this period in Japanese history. We're going to see a growth in large landed estates, which means the wealthy are going to have more land. They will own a significant amount of land, and with that will come wealth and power. We're going to see art and literature of China flourish. Now, look again, that says China. So yes, as I talked about before with Nara, Japanese culture is not center stage here. They are looking to the Japanese are looking at China for a lot of their cultural elements rather than creating their own. They're specifically going to be looking at Tang China. So that is one of our dynasties that we studied, and that is kind of a period in Chinese history that the Japanese really attached to. There's going to be an elaborate court life, which if you've already read about Marisaki Shikibu, you have an idea of what that was like. There's a very specific etiquette. If you were in the upper class, there were levels to it. So if you were in the top 3 levels of society, you got to carry a certain type of fan. And if you were in the 4th level of society, you had to carry a different fan. So it was very structured, and people were very consumed with how they appeared and their place in society. We're going to have a great novel. It is often considered the world's first novel. It is called The Tale of Genji. It is written by a Japanese woman known as Marisaki Shikibu. We will see towards the end of the Heian period A little bit of movement away from Chinese ideals, specifically religion, arts, and government. But in early Heian periods, there is still going to be a strong attachments to many features of Tang China. All right, Prince Shotoku. He is going to rule between 573 and 621. So this slide is a little bit out of order, but I can't move it because I don't want to mess up my recordings, guys. So just bear with me. Prince Shotoku is kind of responsible for that obsession with Tang China. He is going to adopt Confucianism, and we know that was kind of the guidelines for how Tang China ruled itself. We're going to see Buddhism flourish under his reign. He's also going to create a new government structure. They're not going to totally copy the Tang China government structure because we won't see those civil service exams. In Japan, it was still, if your father was important, then you were probably going to get an important place in society. You didn't have to earn your place in society like you did with that merit system. Prince Shotoku is going to send several voyages over to Tang China, or I can't speak, to China to kind of learn about their culture and their government and report back and teach him basically what they are doing in China, and he incorporates that. He is going to come up with a 17-article constitution that outlines his laws. You read about that more in the textbook, but that kind of defines Prince Shotoku's reign. And again, he is the one that is very responsible for the obsession with Tang China. And again, I'm sorry that this slide is a little bit out of order. So I'm going to tell you a few of the cultural elements that Heian Japan borrowed specifically from China. So one, they borrowed the Chinese writing system. Japan had a spoken language, but for a long time they did not have a standard written language. So they're going to, as you already know, copy a lot of the Chinese characters. Today, the two are too far apart to recognize from one to the other. But earlier on, they would have had a lot more similarities. So they're going to kind of create their written language off of the Chinese writing system. Chinese artistic styles. If you look at Chinese and Japanese paintings, you'll typically see a lot of landscapes. And that's going to be some similarities between the two. Also, the style is just, if you were to look at the two of them, you might not be able to recognize one from the other. Buddhism, specifically Zen Buddhism, is going to become popular in Japan. And we know that China was the one that kind of got Buddhism started in this area of the world. They are not going to have the Chinese civil service system. I spoke about this earlier, but let me explain. Remember in China how you had to take a test in order to become part of the bureaucracy. So you weren't just given a job, you had to earn that job. Japan is not going to follow this system. So in Japan, it's kind of like, oh, I'm going to do you a favor because your family has a lot of money, or some, people got things in life because of who they were related to, and they were kind of born into their positions, rather than in China how you could work your way up based on these civil service exams. Here we have several examples of Heian court dress. Now remember I said that the court life had a very strict hierarchy and had a lot of etiquette associated with it. So if you were a part of this hierarchy in the Heian court, looking at these photos, you would probably be able to distinguish what level in society these people were based on the fans that they're holding, the materials their clothing are made out of, the number of layers that they have on. All of those had a semblance. So nothing was just done because they liked it. It was all done because it had some kind of relevance to that social hierarchy that existed in the Heian court. Okay, so we are going to be speaking about feudalism, and the definition is right here. I'll read it to you. Feudalism is a political, economic, and social system based on loyalty, the holding of land, and military service. So as you can see, there is a strict kind of pyramid that outlines the feudal system. If you know anything about Europe in the Middle Ages, you know there are lords, there are knights, there are peasants, and there are kings. That's a feudal system. It is very similar to the Japanese feudal system, and we will compare the two later on. But right now, let me explain a little bit. So let's look at the top of the pyramid. It says shogun. So the shogun is the person kind of running the government. Below the shogun, we have the daimyo. They are the wealthy landowners. Below them are the samurai. So the samurai are the soldiers that protect the land. And below the samurai are the peasants. So this isn't too outlandish of a social system, but there's some differences between like this social hierarchy and ones that we have seen in other places. Because there is a relationship, and it is all based on land holdings and loyalty to the people above you. So you might want to be writing down what I'm saying and then later writing down this social pyramid. This is a more in-depth feudal system, so I kind of wanted to show you this before I got too in-depth. So we can see here, there's a little bit of a difference. There's an emperor at the top of the pyramid. And the reason that the emperor was not on the last pyramid was because he didn't always rule. He was there in charge, supposedly, but he wasn't the one running the show. He was a figurehead. So he had all the privileges of being emperor, but he didn't have to do the daily acts of running the country. That was done by the shogun. You can see that the shogun, the daimyo, the samurai, and the ronin are all part of the warrior class. And they're in the basically middle of the social hierarchy, obviously, with the top classes being higher up. So the shogun controls the country. He's a military leader. Below him are our landowners. These landowners, it's not like they have 5 acres. No, they have thousands of acres that they're trying to protect. And in order to protect their land, they need to hire soldiers. And those soldiers are going to be the samurai. So the samurai are going to be paid by the landowners, and they are going to work for them and protect their land. In the lower group, we have the peasants. Now, the reason the peasants are going to remain loyal to the landowners and to the samurai is because they are providing them protection. The peasants think they're living on the big estates, but they're kind of helpless if an attacker was to come. So they provide food for the groups above them, and in return for this production of food, they are going to give the peasants protection. So the peasants aren't getting the best deal here, but they would rather be protected than, get invaded and attacked. We have our artisans next, and then our merchants. And this is similar to the Chinese social hierarchy. Remember, our merchants are not going to be valued because they aren't making anything themselves to add to society. So that's not really a job that is respected because they're not creating anything. They're just selling products that other people make. So the artisans and the peasants are above them because they are creating things that can be consumed by other members of society, and the merchants are just selling those products. So they are not going to be valued like peasants and artisans. So the samurai live by a very strict code. It is called the Code of Bushido. And there are 4 main characteristics of this code, and this defines how they live. Now we'll see this again when we come to European feudalism, It's referred to as like chivalry then. It's the code that the knights will live by. The samurai are going to have a code that they live by. And the first aspect of Bushido is fidelity, which basically means you are loyal. And that is a huge part of being a samurai. You have to be loyal to your landowner, and you can't like, remember in Rome, how the military would rise up and overthrow people above them. Now, this is not something that is going to happen in Japan because they are loyal. So if you are loyal, you're not going to backstab the person that is employing you. The next aspect would be politeness. This is pretty straightforward. You know what this means, just being kind, using, good manners. The third aspect is a word you might not know. It is called virility, and this basically means being masculine. So being a man's man is something that was important to the samurai, not showing your emotions, being very gruff almost. And then lastly is simplicity. So this is not caring about possessions. You live your life simply. You don't have a lot of elaborate things. Your home would be very simple. You're not too focused on money because it's not something you necessarily need in your life. These four aspects make up the code of Bushido, and it guides the samurai. And in order to be a good samurai, you need to possess these four qualities. And this is something that I took very, very, very seriously. So Zen Buddhism is kind of going to reinforce this idea of Bushido with the samurai. Zen Buddhism is kind of a branch off of another large group of Buddhism. You can see here. It is going to come from India to China, and then from China to Japan, and it's going to reinforce the values of Bushido. So not only do the samurai kind of have this code that they live by, but there's also a religious backing to it. So it's taken very seriously by them. Not only is it something that they take, pride in as part of their job, but it's part of their religion. However, being a samurai is more than a job. It's a way of life. Like, that is something that would be basically the most important thing to you in your life. The Japanese are going to be very lucky. Several times the Mongols attempted to invade Japan. You would think with the giant Mongol Empire, they would conquer this small island just merely several hundred miles away. However, luck got involved. So several times there were huge fleets of ships sent by the Mongols to invade Japan. And on two separate occasions, these fleets of ships are going to be destroyed by storms. There are going to be kamikaze winds that basically crush a lot of the Mongol ships. So either the Mongol soldiers are going to drown aboard these ships, or they'll be stranded on the beach, and then there they will be defeated by the samurai. So the Japanese are going to successfully defend themselves against Mongol invasion, but it wasn't just necessarily their skill. They were lucky. But still, that is a major accomplishment to have defeated the Mongol Empire. And they're probably one of the only groups that, actually defended against the Mongols. We know they did fail to invade Africa, but most people stood no chance against the Mongols. So this kind of goes to show you how well trained and effective our samurai warriors were. So Japan is going to fall into a bit of disarray for around 100 years, and a little bit longer than that too. Before the Warring States period and a little bit afterwards, there's not, a solid leader. So the shoguns are going to fight for power. Now remember, the shogun is basically the second person in the hierarchy. They're that military leader that kind of runs the government for the emperor. The laws are going to be unclear, and we know that one of the characteristics of a good leader is having a clear set of legal code. So the opposite of that would be having an unclear legal code, which would lead to confusion and opportunities for corruption. The samurai are going to remain a consistent power in Japan, and they're going to protect the country. So during the Warring States period, a lot of things are going wrong, but the samurai, remained consistent and helped Japan not fall into complete disarray. We're going to have the arrivals of Europeans in Japan. They're going to bring two very important things: firearms and Christianity. So now we have another religion being introduced to Japanese society. And then we know firearms are really going to affect the samurai. I mean, it's kind of going to make the art of being a samurai less important, because samurai trained for years and years and years. But with guns, it's a lot easier and quicker to become an effective warrior. So that's going to kind of contribute to the downfall of the samurai. The introduction of Christianity is also going to create some conflict in Japan, because the Christians are going to be persecuted against, and the Japanese really didn't want to have trade with the outside world. Despite this Japanese interest from the emperors and the shoguns to not have interaction with outsiders, Christianity is going to grow significantly, and there's going to be a lot of trade with Europe. The Europeans basically forced the Japanese to trade with them. It wasn't something that they were, excited to do. They've kind of said, we're going to trade with you whether you like it or not. All right, so after the Warring States period, we're going to have the Tokugawa shogunate. So this is going to restore some consistency to the Japanese society. So Japan is going to close off trade with Europeans that was occurring during the Warring States period. So the only people that the Tokugawa shoguns are going to allow trade with is the Dutch and the Chinese. So they are very restricted in who they will interact with. And the Dutch could only trade in a specific harbor in Nagasaki. So they weren't allowed to just go anywhere. They had to go to this one specific harbor, and that's all that was allowed. The Christians are basically going to be persecuted, and it's actually going to be outlawed. So the Japanese are kind of trying to return back to their traditional culture and eliminate this influence of Europeans. We're going to see the government become stronger. It's going to centralize power. The shoguns are going to become strong, and that's going to give some more consistency back to government. Trade within the country is going to flourish. Now that means trade between the north and the south, the east and the west. Remember, there are 3,000 islands in Japan, so certain islands might have products that an island all the way across the country needs, so they're going to trade with each other. We're going to see an increase in towns, castles, which are part of the feudal system that kind of serves as a protection for the landowners, and in the case of an attack, the peasants would go in the castle to be protected. The merchants are going to become rich, which means the trade is doing well. So trade makes merchants rich, but just because they have money doesn't mean they improve on the social ladder. So they're still going to be at the bottom of the social ladder. We're going to see some new art forms. Haiku poetry is going to become a very prominent, and if you might have learned about this in language arts, but there's a specific system that this poem has to go to. There's amount of syllables that have to be in each line. And then kabuki theater is going to become prominent. Now this is borrowed a little bit from China, but it is going to become very popular in Japanese culture.